All right, welcome folks to topic 3. In this topic we're going to talk about agile project management. There's a lot of different terms for this out there, but it's really agile or adaptive are very common. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the last topic, in this topic we're going to focus on the agile process, but in that conversation we're going to introduce the people and process concepts that are encountered in the agile framework. We want to have a good comprehensive overview of the agile process and the project roles there. So with that, let's get started on topic 3.
First, agile project management is iterative and incremental. The project management approach that focuses on customer value and team empowerment. In agile, the project manager role shifts from taskmaster to facilitator. Now, a lot of times people think that this taskmaster reference is a negative. Not necessarily. In traditional project management, the project manager role bears a lot of the accountability and responsibility for the project. And a lot of the planning is done up front, so it's already spelled out. Everybody understands what they're supposed to be doing, and the project manager is merely following up to ensure that everything is being done according to plan. With all that accountability on his or her shoulders, it's important for them to make sure everything's getting done in accordance to the plan. In Agile, the lead role is more of a facilitator, and you'll see as we discuss some of the roles how the accountability tends to be spread out among various different team members, not solely in one role like the project manager, as we see in traditional project management. Now, we just described agile projects as iterative and incremental. Those words may sound similar, but they are in fact different. And so let's use some examples to describe the difference. First, we'll cover incremental, because agile projects and traditional projects can be incremental, where agile projects have what we call iterations or sprints, and traditional projects have phases. And so in incremental scenario, you would know exactly what you want up front. And then to create that, you would produce it in increments. This individual knows exactly the picture that she wants to create, and now she breaks it up and does it a few increments at a time until ultimately it's done. Now, iterative is a little different. In an iterative approach, you might not know exactly what you want up front, but maybe you have a general idea. I want a tall red barn. And so you first begin by sketching it out. You draw some trees in the background, maybe a tree in front. You stop, you get some feedback. Maybe you step back and look at it. Someone next to you is giving you some input, what they think. And so you come up with another iteration. And this time you remove the trees, add a small building on the side. You step back, maybe get some feedback from bystanders, and then ultimately put another iteration out there, revising it, adding additional details. And so you develop it iteratively. A critically important part of iterative development is that in between each iteration, you get feedback on how to modify the next iteration. Am I going the right direction? Should I change something? Should I remove something or add something? And that's critically important. So you don't have that with incremental. Incremental is where you just barely piece the different increments together as you go. Iterative is almost like layering, where you're adding a layer, getting feedback, taking that feedback into consideration, adding another layer, stepping back, getting feedback, taking that into consideration, continuing. Now this slide talks about the question that many companies find themselves in: which should I use, agile or traditional? Some companies actually exercise both in the same company. That's fine too. But when considering which method to use, it's important to understand the environment. So in this diagram on the right, you'll see we consider the what around the project and the how. On the left side, you'll see there's close to certainty on the what and far from certainty on the what. In other words, what do we need to do here? What are the features? What are the requirements that we need here? Some people know exactly what they want, and sometimes people know exactly what the requirements are, but they know they need to do something. They just aren't certain. They're not ready to put it all down on paper. That would be far from certainty. Now, the how, sometimes things are very complex and people know they need to create something, but they couldn't tell you exactly how to do it. They need to do an iterative process where they kind of create an initial version and then expand on that until they get a better feel for exactly how to get something done. So the what and the how are the questions here. Now, when you're close to certainty on the what or how, you're in the bottom left corner there. That is an ideal place for traditional projects. Traditional projects are ideal when you know exactly what you want and you know exactly how to do it. You just need to write it down and execute. It's the most efficient way to do it. However, we're not always in those situations. Sometimes we don't know exactly what to do yet. Maybe we've never done it before. Maybe no one else has ever done it before. Or maybe the marketplace conditions are moving and we have a very unstable product. We could spend 6 months putting together a detailed plan, and 2 months into the project, someone would run in the building and say, hey, competitor is doing this now. We need to respond to that change, and we'd have to rework the whole plan. That's expensive. That's a lot of rework. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the what, okay? Because maybe we just don't know yet, haven't made up our mind, or there's a lot of instability in the marketplace. And there's maybe some uncertainty in the how. We've never done it before. It's new to us. It's very complex. We'll need to kind of wade into the water slowly and kind of get our feet wet, and then we'll kind of understand, maybe after several attempts, try it different ways until we figure out how to do this. So when there's a moderate amount of uncertainty in the what or how, that's an ideal environment for agile project management. It allows us to, using that iterative method, to kind of take smaller steps. As the product starts to evolve, we start to get feedback. We start to see the results. We start to get feedback from the customer, and we iteratively move our way through until we have a stronger sense of what we want and how we want to do it. Now, if you get too far out, where there's far from certainty on the what or far from certainty on the how, well, that's chaos. There's no project methodologies probably to help you that far out. In those situations, it probably means spend a little more time understanding exactly what you want to do. And so you can at least move into a moderate level of uncertainty. But when you're far from certainty about the what or how, it probably means you need to put some more thought into what you want to accomplish. Now let's talk about the roles that we find in Scrum. And the first one we'll cover is the product owner. Some people call this the business representative. They represent the stakeholders, the customers out there. The product owner is responsible to consolidate the client requirements, define the features of the product based on market value. So they have to have enough business knowledge to be able to understand which features have more value from a business perspective. Managing project ROI and risk, or return on investment and risk. Adjusting features and their priority on a regular basis. So as new requirements materialize, the product owner would be responsible to reprioritize the requirement list to ensure that the high value requirements go to the top of the list. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get into the framework details. The product owner participates actively in all planning and review meetings and provides answers to questions raised by the project team. The product owner needs to stay available to the team, so if the team has questions, they can get quick answers. If the product owner doesn't know the answer to the question, they are still responsible to go get that answer and bring it back to the team so the team can stay focused on getting the work done. And determining the release plan and communicating with stakeholders. The release plan is something we haven't talked about yet, but just understand it's like a project schedule, but it's for Agile. And the product owner is responsible to determine at what point is the product ready to turn over to the customer. They are also responsible for gathering the requirements, as we said in the first bullet, and communicating status on the project to the stakeholder community. They are also responsible for accepting or rejecting work results. So they're in the demonstrations, seeing the presentations by the team and determining, yes, I like what you've done, or this is not what I asked for. So that's a very important role of the product owner. Now we also have the Scrum Master. Some people might call this the project manager, but it's a facilitator role. The Scrum Master helps the team by working to resolve barriers faced by the team, improving the productivity of the team, and keeping the team effective, enabling close cooperation among various roles and functions, and keeping track of training requirements to avoid delay in deliverables. The Scrum Master also protects the team from outside interference and disruption, and organizing and facilitating Scrum-related activities and meetings. So we'll talk about some of these Scrum activities and meetings a little bit later, but the Scrum Master is responsible to coach the team and facilitate the meetings. The Scrum Master is responsible to not only facilitate these meetings, but ensure that the team follows good Scrum standards. Now last, we'll talk about Scrum teams. Now these are the people who are going to be doing the work, creating the software, developing the new training program, or whatever the deliverable is. The Scrum team is that cross-matrix group of people with all the skill sets necessary to get all the work done. And so that's your Scrum team. And so they are responsible to select the goal and specify the work results. In other words, when they're being asked to do the next increment of work, they're expected to step up and decide among themselves, how much work do we think we can do in the next iteration, in the next 2 to 4 weeks. The team is responsible for organizing the team and the work. And so they're empowered to self-organize and self-direct, demonstrating work results to the product owner. The development team, or the Scrum team, when they're done with an increment of work, they are responsible to present it, to demonstrate it to the product owner, the business representative, and providing the product owner with inputs and ideas about the final product. And so just like the external stakeholders that the product owner is working with, the product owner can also get advice from the team about things that need to be done. Keep in mind, the product owner is a business representative. So they know the business, they know what value looks like, but sometimes they don't have strong technical knowledge, and the team can step in and provide that information for the product owner. This is what the framework looks like, and we'll go over each part of the framework in the next few slides. Now let's talk about the product backlog. This is a list that the team keeps of all the known features that are to be implemented throughout the project. This list represents everything they think that needs to be done at that point in time. It can evolve. That list may change over time, but at that point in time, it's everything they think they need to do. The product owner is the one who is primarily responsible for the product backlog. So they are responsible also to groom the backlog. That means if something gets added to the product backlog, they need to be aware of it. If something gets taken off, they need to understand that. And also they're responsible to prioritize the product backlog and sort the features from the most valuable at the top all the way down to the least valuable. That activity is often referred to as grooming, or grooming the backlog. Now let's look at the sprint planning meeting. Sometimes this is also referred to as iteration planning. And this meeting is where they determine what will be accomplished in the next iteration or next sprint. In the first half of the meeting, the product owner goes to the top of the list, because these are the features with the highest value, and describes in detail these features at the top of the list, because they're the ones who are the candidates to be pulled into the next iteration. Remember, they're always drawing work from the top of the product backlog. That way, if the backlog is prioritized with the highest value features at the top, they're always pulling off the most valuable features to work on in the next iteration. So the product owner will describe in detail these features at the top of the list, so that the development team, the sprint team, or Scrum team, can understand what the details are. And the Scrum team is allowed to ask questions, get clarification from the product owner so they understand. Keep in mind, the Scrum team is made up of all the different skill sets, the testers, the developers, the UI, the graphical designers. Everybody on the team may have different questions depending on what they are responsible for doing in creating the new product or service. But the product owner will answer their questions in the first half of the meeting. In the second half of the meeting, the team will decide among themselves how much of the work, beginning from the top of the product backlog, working their way down, how many of those features they think they can finish in the next iteration. They'll commit to that work, and then they'll spend the rest of the sprint planning meeting deciding how they will divide up that work, how that work will be accomplished, and they'll take those features, those user stories, and break them down further into what we call tasks. But they get the work ready among themselves. They determine how they're going to get the work done. In the second half of the meeting, the team commits to how much work they think they can get done, and then they use the rest of the meeting to decide how they're going to do that work in the next 1 to 4 weeks. Now, the sprint backlog, also known as the iteration backlog, is a list of those higher priority items that the team drew from the top of the product backlog that they believe they can finish in the next iteration. Now let's talk about the sprint, or what we sometimes call the iteration. It can be anywhere from 1 to 4 weeks. Usually the team will sit down with the product owner and decide how long the iterations will be, or maybe the organization may have a consistent duration. Maybe the organization likes to do 2-week sprints as a normal standard length of time, and that's fine, right? But it's time boxed. It means once you decide how long the iteration is, it usually stays that length, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, however long. And it doesn't change. In the middle of the project, you don't all of a sudden decide you're going to do a 5-week iteration or a 3-week iteration. It usually stays consistent, so the team can develop a cadence, a rhythm, where they can get adjusted to that length of that iteration. It also helps them determine their velocity, something we'll talk about a little bit later. The daily stand-up is a time-boxed 15-minute meeting that they have every 24 hours, every day. It's typical to have this in the first thing in the morning, and before people's schedules get complicated. Everybody sits down, and every team member answers 3 questions. What have I done since the last meeting? In other words, what have I done in the last 24 hours? What do I intend to do before the next meeting? And what am I having difficulties with at this point? The nice thing about the daily stand-up is if you need to ask someone a question, you know as a team member that you're going to see all the other team members every day at the same time. You're going to see them in the daily stand-up. So you don't have to stop or try and make a special trip or find this person and interrupt their schedule. You know that you'll see them every 24 hours, so you can wait to those daily stand-ups. And you know that everybody's going to provide an update on what they've been working on, what they intend to work on next, and what kind of difficulties they're having. And so you know at that point you're not only going to get an update, but if you need to talk to them after the meeting, you can stop them and chat at that point. But it's a daily meeting with all the team members, and it's consistent. The warning here is do not let people solve problems during the daily stand-up. In a lot of technical teams, it's very easy for someone to step in and start to say, oh, you're having that problem? Let me tell you how to fix that. Well, then you have that scenario where you have 8 team members all standing in a circle, 2 people are talking, and the other 6 are waiting for them to finish talking so they can go on to do their work, right? So what you don't want is to solve problems during that meeting. Just focus on getting those 3 questions answered. Everybody gets updated, and then if you finish in 15 minutes or even before 15 minutes, excuse the team so everybody can get back to work. And then if anybody has anything to resolve, they can stay behind and have those conversations after the daily stand-up. The sprint review meeting. The sprint review meeting is what you perform at the end of an iteration. The team presents what they've accomplished to the product owner, and the product owner reviews the work to determine if they like it, if they accept it, or it's not what they expected. It also might be an opportunity to provide feedback on what other things that they think they need based on the demonstration. So after several demonstrations, the product owner may say, you know what, now that I see this, I'm starting to get a better feel for what we need. And so they might submit some more features to be added to the product backlog based on what they're seeing in these sprint review meetings. Remember we saw the diagram of the iterative process? The person was thinking about a tall red barn. There was an iteration. They reviewed the results. They provided feedback and then did another iteration. That's what's happening in the review meeting. The team is demonstrating this is what we've done, this is what you asked us to do, we've completed it, this is what it looks like, and the product owner who represents the customer is looking at it, kind of determining, is that what I want? If yes, they might say, keep going, I like it. If it's not exactly right, they might say, I like this, but I want to change this. Or they might say, wow, based on what I've seen, I need to go a completely different direction. And they might throw some of the product backlog items out and add some new ones to take the team in a better direction, a direction where they perceive as more value. So these are very important meetings because it's the opportunity to get that valuable feedback that all Agile projects need. Now, before we go to the last meeting, let's talk about the definition of done. Now, this is an important term, and it's something a product owner, and frankly all the team members, need to understand during the review meeting and frankly throughout the project. The definition of done is the state at which a feature is considered complete. It can have multiple steps involved, but done must be clearly understood by the entire team. A feature is not done until all the agreed upon steps have been completed. And there's no room for almost done. When a product owner is sitting in a review meeting, they must understand what done is, and they want to ensure that what is being presented to them is done, not half-baked, won't show up again in another meeting down the road, but is done. Okay? Because it's potentially possible after a review meeting, the product owner might say, I'm so impressed with the feature you just showed me that I want to have an early release to get this feature out the door. And then someone says, well, it's not really finished yet. You think a product owner would like to hear that? No, the assumption from the product owner is the things that are being presented are potentially shippable features that could be sent out the door. And so you should not be presenting something in a review meeting to a product owner that's not done according to the common definition. Now, what's a common definition of done? It can be different from one team to the next, but it can include things like reviewed by the team members, we've completed all unit testing, completed the quality assurance testing, all the QA testing, all the documentation is done, and all the defects are fixed. You know, if all these things are checked off, you can present it in the review meeting. Now let's talk about the sprint retrospective. This meeting typically happens shortly after the review meeting. The meeting is at the end of an iteration and before the next iteration, where the team discusses what went well, what didn't go well, right? What went well do we want to continue doing, and what didn't go well that we need to improve on? The goal is continuous improvement from one sprint to the next. And it's not unusual that you'll have a team that you will actually see performing better and better and better due to the conversations that they're having in their retrospective meetings. Let's talk about releases and iterations. Releases are about delivering features, benefits, or values to the customer. In other words, at what point are we going to put this product in the customer's hands so they can actually try it out? Usually, releases are made up of multiple iterations or sprints, generally determined by the customer or product owner. So at what point we are ready to turn the product over to the customer is up to the product owner. The product owner knows the business and can look at the features and determine at what point they are comfortable that this product or service is ready for the customer to start using or trying out. And the release plan is not an edict by the product owner, but a plan. The plans in Agile can be fluid. They may change. So this is something that the product owner is involved in determining what is the release plan, and they determine when the release will happen. But if we have some new features come into the product backlog, the product owner may change the release slightly to accommodate some of those new features if they want that to be included in the release as it's released to the customer. So now let's talk about iterations. And iterations and sprints mean the same thing. Smaller than a release, more technically oriented. They typically last from 1 to 4 weeks, and the length of an iteration is typically consistent. It means that usually stays the same. Once you determine you're going to have a 2-week release, you'll usually stay and keep it 2 weeks for the duration of the project, or 4 weeks, or 1 week, or however long you determine you would like to make your iterations. And so they keep them consistent, so it helps them to determine their velocity. We haven't talked about velocity yet, but velocity is referring to how much work a team can do during an iteration. And so if your one iteration is 3 weeks, and then you do a 2-week iteration the next time, it's going to be hard to know what is our standard velocity of our team if the length of our iterations continues to change. So teams tend to keep the length of the iterations consistent. With some projects, the first iteration is referred to as iteration 0. And some teams do iteration 0, some don't. So don't think it's something you have to do. But iteration 0 is what teams use many times to do setup. They set up their environment, they set up their products, they install software during that time. They do a lot of the pre-work on a project that doesn't show up in the product backlog. Then when all the pre-work is done, all the setup is done, then they go to the product backlog and select their first iteration, which represents iteration 1. Some teams also use what we call iteration H, or a hardening iteration. This is usually the last iteration of a release, and at the point where the product owner has determined they think that the product is ready to be released to the customer, they'll add one more iteration called a hardening iteration, where they'll tighten things down, do any final testing to ensure it's ready to be released to the customer. Not everybody uses hardening iterations, but for the organizations that do, that basically describes a period, an iteration, where you're not delivering new functionality, you're just finalizing, tightening things down, doing any final testing, so it's customer ready. So let's tie it all together. Let's talk about release planning and iteration planning. In release planning, we have our product backlog like we described earlier in the course. Remember, the backlog is a collection of user stories. Usually your high value items are at the top of the backlog and your low value items are at the bottom. Let's assume that we have 200 points of work. We've done our relative estimating on all the user stories and we came up with 200 points. It's not much, but this is just an example. Keep the math simple, right? So we come up with a backlog that has 200 points of work. We estimate that our team velocity, how many points our team can do in a 2-week period, and that our length of our iterations is 2 weeks, that the team can do 40 points of work every iteration. Okay? If we understand that, then we should be able to calculate the number of iterations, knowing that there's 200 points of work and our team can do 40 points of work every iteration or every 2 weeks. That should help us to come up with an understanding of how many iterations it will take to finish all the work in the product backlog. Once we know that, we can start to create what we call a release schedule. Sometimes they call it a product roadmap, but a release schedule is where we look and see what the iterations are, and then the product owner comes and looks at what work is being completed in which iteration and determines at what point this product is ready to release to the customer. A product owner may determine that they'll want to do a preliminary release to maybe a small subset of customers initially, which often is referred to as a beta release, and then it allows them to get it into the hands of some of the customers and get some valuable feedback on that product or service ahead of time, which may allow them to make some adjustments in the product or service over the next couple iterations until they do their final release at the end of the project. Some projects don't have a beta release, some do, but that's the decision of the product owner. A release schedule is the same as a project schedule in traditional project management. So the advantage of release planning is it gives you an understanding of how much work is in your project, how many iterations are required, and if you know the length of your iterations and you know how many iterations, you know approximately how many weeks it's going to take you to finish that project. So 5 2-week iterations essentially is a 10-week project. Now let's talk about iteration planning. And we've talked about this before. Remember, we talked about the Scrum planning meeting where we spend the first half of the meeting where the product owner describes what's at the top of the product backlog. The second part of the meeting, the team decides what they're going to do and how they're going to do it in that next iteration. And so this is going to describe that in some more detail. So as we talked about before, the product owner provides a detailed overview of the next few user stories at the top of the product backlog. The Scrum team asks questions to gain better understanding. The Scrum team decides how many user stories they can complete in the next sprint and commits to getting them done. And then the team converts those user stories to tasks and estimates the tasks. You'll notice that each iteration has detailed planning at the beginning of that iteration. So we do high-level planning at the beginning of the project to create our product backlog, but that we do detailed planning at the beginning of each iteration, where the team breaks those user stories down into tasks and the team estimates the tasks. When they're estimating the product backlog, they don't want to invest a large amount of time doing detailed absolute estimating on work items that may or may not be done. There's a lot of uncertainty, particularly in the items at the lower end of the product backlog. And so they tend to use relative estimating so they can get a quick assessment of approximately how much work is in the product backlog. And not until the team commits to doing that work, and they do that at the beginning of each iteration, then they will take a step and do detailed planning on just the work they've committed to. So one of the things that's important to understand about iteration planning is that's where the detailed planning happens. In traditional projects, we do a lot of the detailed planning up front. We do all the planning, we base it on our project, and then we execute based on that plan. In Agile, we come up with an initial high-level plan, we come up with our user stories, we put our relative estimates on those user stories to get a general understanding of approximately how much work is there. That allows us to create a release schedule fairly quickly. And then when we start to work our way down that product backlog, starting from the high value features at the top and working our way down, then as we select an iteration of work, the team does detailed planning at the beginning of each iteration. So Agile projects do detailed planning, they just spread it out and do it iteration by iteration. So when the team gets into that iteration planning meeting, the product owner describes the work, the team commits to the user stories, and then breaks those user stories down into tasks. And then the team estimates the tasks based on absolute time. They use our estimates on the tasks at this point. And why do they do the absolute or ideal time estimating on the tasks? Because now they're ready to invest the effort into doing detailed estimates on that work because they've committed to that work. Before that, when the work was in the product backlog, particularly at the bottom of the product backlog, they didn't know if that work would be thrown away, if they'd ever have to do that work. Because remember, the product backlog is evolving. Things are coming in, things are being removed, and not until those items come to the top of the backlog and are drawn into the next iteration does the team know with certainty that they're going to do that work. And so they don't do the detailed estimating on that product backlog item until it makes it into an iteration and they've got it in their scope, right? And they know they're going to do it. So at that point, they commit to doing detailed estimates on those user stories by breaking them down into tasks and to estimate those tasks in hours. Now, teams that are new to Agile and new to story pointing many times find it difficult with this concept of relative estimating. But it's important to understand that once your team starts, it is possible to tie those story points to an actual dollar amount and duration. And I'll explain how in this illustration. So let's take your product backlog again. And let's say that you have prioritized that product backlog and you've sized all of the user stories in the product backlog, and you determined that there is 100 story points of work in your product backlog. Let's also assume that your team has a velocity of 20 story points per iteration. Your team can complete 20 story points of work every 2 weeks. With that information, you can calculate how many iterations it'll take, and you can start to create your product roadmap showing the 5 iterations. And if your product backlog has been prioritized already, you can start to show which user stories will be completed in each iteration. Now, if you know your team's burn rate, so let's say, for example, it's $10,000 every 2 weeks. That's how much the salaries of your team are. And then what you know your velocity and your burn rate, you can calculate the cost per point and the time per point. So with that information, the cost per point, knowing that your burn rate is 10,000 and your velocity is 20 points, every point in your product backlog is worth $500. So if you have a user story and it's a 3-point story, you would look at that user story and say, is that story worth $1,500 because it's a 3-point story? If it's a 5-point story, is that user story worth $2,500? So understanding your velocity and understanding your burn rate are valuable because once you understand that, you can tie your relative estimates to actual hours and actual dollars. The time per point, using those same numbers, would say that every point is worth 0.5 days or 4 hours. So if you looked at a user story and it had an estimate of 8 points on it, you would say, okay, is that worth 4 days of work from our team? So again, once you know your burn rate and your velocity, it allows you to identify the actual dollar amount and duration of a point. And to understand your team's velocity, you usually give it 2 to 3 iterations to get a comfortable understanding of what your true velocity is.